Hello and welcome to the first in our series, 10 Crucial Convictions, a study in the book of Job. What I believe is really important. In fact, what I believe shapes everything in my life. What I believe decides how well I cope with life. And if my beliefs are faulty or erroneous, my life will eventually come off the rails. But if my beliefs are good, then I will be like the rock of Gibraltar. And so this is a study on what we believe. Now, there is a big difference between what I say I believe and what I really believe. I almost instinctively point to my head and my heart on that. Sometimes we say it's 18 inches from head to heart, but the longest journey in the world, and that is true. What I really believe is my convictions, and it's my convictions that stand me in good stead for life. Now, what I say I believe and what I really believe is related to the conscious and the unconscious mind. The mind is like an iceberg, where 9/10 of it is below the waterline. It's quite a scary thought that 9/10 of my mind is actually unknown to me. It's unconscious. By definition, I don't know what's down there. And to make matters worse, between the conscious and the unconscious, there's like a brick wall. There's almost an unwillingness for the unconscious to reveal itself. Part of what makes up that brick wall is something called denial. We don't want to know what's down there because I think we have a feeling that it won't be nice. And so we try to avoid finding out what's down there. But it's down there, and it's what's down there that's actually running my life. Now, there is a famous story of an incident in America where a group of parents were watching their boys play soccer. And an argument broke out between two of the parents and got more and more heated until one of the fathers picked up a brick and hit the other over the head and killed him over a children's soccer game. Of course, the man was arrested, put in prison, and was awaiting trial. And he was granted an interview. And on the interview, he said this amazing thing. He said, "I don't know what came over me. I'm not a violent man." That is a classic case of denial, because he is actually a very violent man. It just never come out before in that way. But as long as he goes on denying it, he'd better be kept in prison, because he's nowhere near realizing what he's really like. Denial is more than a river in Egypt. And so the question arises, how do I know what's in my unconscious? Because it's a little scary that all the stuff is down there and I don't know what it is. How do I find out? Because I need to find out. It's running my life and it may be ruining my life. And so I need to find out what's down there. Well, I'm going to give you 3 very brief ways in which I believe the unconscious reveals itself to our conscious mind. The first is dreams. Dreams are the highway to the unconscious. Sometimes you wake up from a dream and it was just a shambles, and when you wake up in the morning you say, that was just my brain emptying itself of the rubbish of the day. And that is pretty much what it was. But every now and again you wake up from a dream and you realize that was important. Somehow that was big. It is possible to teach yourself to remember your dreams and then to go for someone who can help you interpret, and you can gain a great deal by doing that. Second way we can find out what's inside us, and we do find out what's inside us, is when we come under pressure. Now, I have here a chamois leather that I wash my car with, and when I hold it in my hand, nothing happens. But when I squeeze it, water comes out. A lot of water comes out. Now, the question is, why does water come out? Well, because I squeezed it. Yes, that's one answer. Let me ask the question slightly differently. Why does water come out? The answer is because water is what was inside. When I come under pressure and under stress, what is really inside comes out. For example, that man who killed someone else. That was a moment for him to realize what was really inside him. He chose to deny it and not to find out. And so dreams and pressure certainly reveal what's down there. But we come now to the book of Job, and the third way that we can find out what's down inside us, and it's art. believe it or not. Art, real art. Real art, as opposed to just entertainment, real art contains what is called an objective correlative. What that means is that there's something out there, objective, that correlates to something that's deep inside me. And when I see it, I feel an emotional connection. I cry or something or other. That's a sign that the objective correlative is relating to something real inside me. A silly little example. Do you remember, those of us who are old enough, The Little House on the Prairie with Michael Landon? My family all watched it, but I didn't watch it because I rather looked down on it. I noticed that my wife cried always around 40-minute mark, and it was very sentimental when I put my head in the door. But now and again I got trapped and I ended up watching a program, and guess what? Around about 35 minutes, I started crying. It was generally when some child or other was in trouble and some adult finally understood and started to help them and get them out of their trouble. And I started to cry. Now, what that is telling me is this, that something in House on the Prairie correlated with something deep inside me. And that was a chance to examine what was inside me. And it was actually quite valuable. And so there are the three ways we can learn what's inside of us. And art is the one we want to look at now, because the book of Job is a work of art. Now, it's not our modern style of art, but it actually is a dramatic poem. You're not meant to read it, you're meant to sit and watch actors recite it. And in its day, it would have been quite a real method of work of art. And the idea is that as you listen, as you watch, as you read, suddenly it relates to you. And I hope some of that may happen while we're going through this series. There is tremendous power in story and symbol. And so art and Job is a book of art. So now we come to the actual book. We begin with Job chapter 1, verse 1. And we read that Job was blameless and upright. It's repeated again in chapter 1, verse 8, and again in chapter 2, verse 3. In other words, the book really wants to get the message across to us that Job is blameless and upright. Now, there are only 4 people in the whole Bible who are ever called good other than Jesus, believe it or not. They are Job, Simeon, Joseph of Arimathea, and Barnabas. Only those 4 are ever called good. It's quite a rare thing in the Bible for someone to be called good. Now, it does not mean that Job was perfect. No human being is perfect. And I will point out 1 or 2 of his failings to you, but he's not perfect. When I was a school teacher many years ago, when I started out as an English teacher, we never gave a pupil 100% for an English essay. You just didn't do that because you would be saying to him, you're as good as Shakespeare. And then a wonderful teacher by the name of Malcolm Armstrong came along, and he said, but why do we do that? We're not measuring the child against William Shakespeare. We're measuring the child against what you can expect of a 16-year-old in an examination situation. And if he does the best you can expect, give him 100%. And we actually took to doing that. It was a kind of change in perspective. We're not saying he's Shakespeare. We're not saying he's perfect. We're saying it's the best you could expect in that situation. And that's what we're saying about Job. He was as good as you can ask from a human being. And God really appreciated that. Upright and blameless. Now, this is actually the key to the whole book, because the issue is this. Job's suffering had nothing to do with his sins or failures. Job's suffering had nothing to do with his sins or failures. And that leads us to crucial conviction number 1. We are not in a reward and punishment relationship with God. We are not in a reward and punishment relationship with God. And there are 2 corollaries to that. 1, when things go wrong, it is not necessarily God punishing us. Number 2, when things go right, it is not necessarily God rewarding us. Now note the word necessarily, because there are times when it is God punishing us, and there are times when it is God rewarding us. I think as a general rule, when God's children get themselves into sin and won't repent, they're playing with fire, and God may well do something in their life. Equally, when someone is upright and blameless, God often will actually pour prosperity of various kinds and success into their lives. I think that's true. But it's not always true. It's not a rule. And there are times when very good people are required to suffer very deep things. And so we are not in a reward and punishment relationship with God. But it's very deeply ingrained in us. From childhood, you're taught, aren't you? You get nothing for nothing. You have to work for everything. There's no such thing as a free lunch. We're brought up on that all the time. My mother, who was a good Baptist woman, and if you'd asked her what she believed, she would say she believed in grace. But one day she was on a Sunday doing some knitting, and suddenly she fell ill and was rushed off to hospital. I believe that it might have been a miscarriage of what would have been my younger sibling, which I never had. Whatever it was, she was rushed off to hospital. She told me many years later that she believed for many years that she had been punished for knitting on a Sunday. Would you believe? But there it was. I'm in a reward and punishment relationship with God. It's very deep-seated. We even learn it at Christmas from Santa Claus. Santa Claus is this wonderful figure with a big beard and a big stomach. By the way, he's not allowed to be fat in England these days. That's considered a bad example to children, so Santa Clauses have to be thin. But Santa Claus, this happy, jovial figure who brings you presents on Christmas. But under the surface, it's not quite the same. Have you noticed how many pictures of Santa have him with a list and a pen and paper? There's a lovely song, Santa Claus is coming to town. And then it says he's making a list, he's checking it twice, he's going to find out who's naughty and nice. And it says, so you better not pout, you better not cry. Now how's that for teaching children to repress? Repress your emotion. Don't be angry, don't cry, don't feel sad. Because if you don't, Santa will not bring you presents. I call it Santa with claws. So we are taught from very young that we live in a reward and punishment relationship with God. And it's quite sad. It runs very deep and it can do great harm. Then we move on to chapter 1, verse 5. And we read, early in the morning, Job would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of his children. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful that he prayed for his children like that. My mom and dad, I was in a group of young people. We used to meet at the church and play volleyball every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon around 5. And my parents would arrive with another couple, and their car would be parked outside the church for about an hour while we played volleyball. And I never knew what that was about. Years later, I discovered that every Monday, they missed breakfast, they missed lunch, they met at the church at 5 o'clock, and they prayed for their children. There were 7 of us all together. Do you know that all 7 of those ended up serving the Lord? I don't think that's an accident, because our parents fasted and prayed for us. I don't believe I'd be standing here preaching to you today if it hadn't been for those prayers. It's a wonderful thing when parents pray for their children. But there is a but to this. Notice that Job is carrying a fear, because it goes on to say, it may be that my children have sinned. He's just carrying a little fear that maybe his children have sinned. I will talk more about that next week. And we read on now to chapter 1, verse 6. It begins, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. Lovely picture in heaven. Angels coming to present themselves before the Lord. Angels love to be in the presence of the Lord. You remember that when the angel Gabriel came to Zechariah in the temple, Zechariah said, who are you? And his answer was, I am Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of the Lord. Almost as if to Gabriel, that's what I do for a living. And I just love my job. Angels love being in the presence of the Lord. But then we read on in verse 6. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth and going to and fro on it. Here is this picture in heaven of angels and Satan coming before the Lord. Angels love being in the presence of the Lord. Satan is extremely uncomfortable there. He doesn't like to be in the presence of the Lord. Rather, he spends his time wandering to and fro across the earth, causing trouble. And notice the restlessness of that. Satan is by very nature restless. Demons are by nature restless. And so we have this picture of Satan and the angels appearing before God in this great scene. And it leads us to crucial conviction number 2. Satan and the spirit world are real and opposed to God and his people. If I don't believe that, if I'm living just on a surface level of what I see as all there is, I will never cope adequately with life, and I become very vulnerable. There is more than one level going on right here around us, an angel and a demon world. And if I don't believe it's true, I'm going to get in trouble. Look at Jesus' ministry. Did you know that about 1/3 of Jesus' ministry was spent on casting out demons? Now we need to ask, was Jesus deluded? Was he just sort of ignorant? If he'd lived in the 20th century, he'd have known better. Well, if you think that of Jesus, you don't serve the Jesus I do. Of course he wasn't deluded. They were extremely real. I believe they actually gathered in Israel at that time to try and destroy his work. It was very real. When I was a young guy, probably about 15 or 16, we had a missionary by the name of Hayden Millsop came to talk to us. He spent many years in China before they were kicked out in 1953. And he told of his experiences with the demon world. He was a New Zealander. He came to China. He was learning language. And then a Chinese pastor came to him and said, "Mr. Millsop, do you believe in demons? Because you can't minister in China if you don't." And he said with his brain, "Yes, I do." But he was to discover that his conviction was actually that he didn't. And the pastor said, "Come with me." He took him down to a Hindu temple. And there in that Hindu temple, in one alcove, there was a group of men. And they stood watching various things. And then the pastor said, "Look." And these men, sitting on little stools, put down their books. They had already folded their legs lotus style. They folded their arms as well, went into a kind of glazed look, and then lifted up from their stools and started floating around that whole alcove, about 20 of them. And he said, being a Westerner, I was looking for wires and tricks. You see, really doesn't believe. And anyway, this was way into China. This was no Western area. Years later, he was very high in the highlands of China, where everyone came out to see this white man. No one had ever seen one before. And a demon-possessed child came out and started swearing and cursing to him in English, in the worst language he'd ever heard a sailor use. She didn't learn those words. There was a demon possession going on. And Hayden Millsop said, "You know what convinced me most? It wasn't the girl speaking in English. It wasn't the floating around of the priests. It was the terrible depression that came on me after I'd been to that Hindu temple. I wanted to kill myself, and I was not a depressive man, and it went on for about 6 weeks, until eventually there was prayer for me by the Chinese pastors for my deliverance from the oppression that I was feeling from those demons." And so, if I'm to live a meaningful life at all, I need to understand that life is on more than one level. God is real. Jesus is real. Angels are real. And Satan and his demons are real. And I need to know how to deal with them. Now, there are two reactions people generally have to these teachings. One is to kind of poo-poo it. You know, Andrew, you're really making a bit too much of this now. And they accuse us of seeing demons behind every bush. The other extreme is for Christians to become over-concerned, over-aware, and they really are seeing demons behind every bush, and fearful. There is nowhere in the New Testament that suggests we should be living fearful lives. Quite the opposite. There is no need to be fearful. But it's real. It's real. Now the issue is, don't be afraid. If you suspect, one way or another, that there's something like this in your family or yourself, I suggest you go straight out and buy the book, The Bondage Breaker by Neil Anderson. That book will give you practical ways that you can deal with any issue that might be in your life. The bottom line is, Satan and his demons are real and are trying to destroy God's people. And so it's really important to get these crucial convictions deep into my being. We've had 2 of them today. The other 10 will come in the next 2 talks. But if you get these convictions deep within you and live by them, you will be like the rock of Gibraltar. Nothing will be able to shake you.